Thank you all so much for being here. We're excited to jump into our webinar today on commercial insurance demystified with our partners at Hub International and KITE Research Institute. My name is Evan McDonald. I'm the program manager at Access to Success. We'll start with a bit of housekeeping and then we'll dive into the presentation. So firstly, the session is being recorded and a copy of the event recording will be uploaded to YouTube after the event. Live captioning is available and you can access the feature in your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, we'll ask you to remain on mute during the presentation, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll have time at the end of the presentation to go through some of those questions. Also, please, let us know who you are, where you're calling from in the chat. Let's all use this time to get to know each other. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Varun Shendak, the founder and executive director at Access to Success.
Thank you, Evan, and hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. It's a great pleasure to have all of you joining us today. I will keep this super short. I just wanted to take a quick minute to mention why we do what we do. Access to Success started because I have a couple of disabilities myself, and I have personally experienced the life-changing impact of assistive technology. It literally changed my life for me, and so we do what we do so that we can help other entrepreneurs, like many of you here, change the lives of other people with disabilities. How we do that, I will let Evan talk a little bit about that. Evan, back to you.
Thank you. Great. So as you've now heard, Access to Success is a free global accelerator for accessibility startups. It's a program specifically designed for disabilities, including mobility, hearing, vision, cognition, neurodiversity, mental health, aging, rehabilitation. Essentially, if you're building anything that touches upon any of these categories or helps address challenges in any of these categories, everything that we do is for you. We do very tech-focused programming and content. We don't do any of the kind of generic content. So all of our 40 plus masterclasses, mentorship, networking, and resources are specifically designed for our accessibility-focused innovators. Our program has been mentored by over 200 of the most well-known leaders in the disability innovation space worldwide, sharing what they've learned over the years directly with our companies. Seen here are some of the companies in our current cohort, many of whom are in the mobility and neurodiversity space. We've got a diverse portfolio of hardware, software, and hybrid companies. Since 2019, we've supported 78 companies across 6 cohorts in 10 countries, supported over $55 million in funding raised and $48 million in revenue generated, while providing over 400 hours of programming. But most importantly, these startups have already benefited over 2 million people to date. And we're so fortunate to work with a vast network of sponsors, partners, and collaborators to make this reality for our startups, because this isn't something that we could do on our own. We've got 2 amazing events coming up. First is our Accessibility Innovation Exchange happening in person on October 1st, bringing the accessibility innovation ecosystem and innovators in one room to learn more about all the opportunities out there. We also have our demo day happening on November 24th to celebrate our current cohort. You can register for both events by using the QR code on the screen or by clicking on the links shared in the chat. And of course, please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn and sign up for our newsletter to get updated on all of the exciting opportunities. And with that, I'm excited to pass it over to Anthony Palma, the Director of Partnerships and Strategic Initiatives at KITE-UHN, a dear friend, partner, and mentor at ATS. Anthony, over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Varun. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Palma. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Strategic Initiatives at the KITE Research Institute. KITE is the research and innovation arm of Toronto Rehab at the University Health Network, Canada's largest research hospital. We span about 10 hospital sites, 12 medical programs, and we're also a world leader in rehabilitation science and proud to be recognized on the Forbes Accessibility 100 list for our leadership in the accessibility space and inclusive innovation. So what makes KITE so exciting is that we're not just a lab, we're a living test bed. Ideas don't sit on the shelf. They're validated with real patients, clinicians, and data so that innovations can be tested and proven in the environments where they will actually be used. For startups and SMEs, that means we can shorten your path to market and help de-risk innovation. We connect you with expert researchers, clinicians, partners, creative services through our KITE Studio, our in-house creative agency. We also create global visibility platforms through our iCare, our International Innovation Conference. And beyond the research, we can support your commercialization journey, give you access to expert consultations, user assessments to pilot studies, clinical validations and testing, and access to our state-of-the-art simulation facilities. In addition to that, we have access to a wide range of patient populations and educational opportunities. This helps build a really healthy ecosystem. But we know that innovation, technology, above all that, it's all about building the resilience for your businesses. That's why together with our partners with Access to Success and Hub International, we're committed to giving SMEs those resources to help you. And one of the most overlooked and absolutely critical resources is insurance. The right insurance strategy can protect your intellectual property, mitigate liabilities, and help boost investor confidence and safeguard your growth. So I'm really excited today. We have Hub International, global leader in insurance and risk management. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our friend Liam Brown, Canadian healthcare and life sciences practice leader at Hub International, who will be leading today's workshop on how SMEs can de-risk their ventures and protect their innovation journey. Thanks, Liam.
That's
Sure,
great.
perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity ultimately. And Anthony, thank you for the warm introduction. You actually started to sound like an insurance person there, talking about liability and risk. So apparently I'm rubbing off on you a little bit. As an overarching statement, I think as Anthony mentioned, insurance as a subject matter has been commonly overlooked, especially by the startup community. And the goal today is to provide a bit of that overarching education and knowledge to help startup and SMEs better appreciate risk, better appreciate insurance solutions that are out there, and better plan for potential future costs so that there are less surprises along the commercialization journey. A quick agenda, cognizant of time, we'll just jump right through it. For context, I'll mention the word life sciences as an approach because we talk about providing coverage and insurance solutions to life sciences and life sciences startups. But by life sciences, I'm referring to everything within that life sciences ecosystem. So it is the pharma, biotech, the nutraceuticals, but it is certainly also the medical devices, the digital health and health IT. I mean, anything that is a medical related product that engages with a user group, we would call a life sciences product. So when I refer to life sciences, know that I am talking about the full spectrum, and again, the insurance solutions that could be applicable to anyone working within that space. And while we're talking about it as life sciences, a lot of the insurance solutions we're talking about are applicable to tech-related companies or to companies in any industry ultimately. So the coverages do span across any type of industry, but we'll get into the weeds a little bit on medical-related exposure in companies and what you should be thinking about as you continue along that commercialization journey. And a little bit about Hub, and again, I guess why we're here and why we have this sort of expertise to share and impart on the group. Hub is, I mean, a top insurance brokerage around the world. We are the largest in Canada, I think the sixth largest in the world, over 20,000 employees. We have a dedicated team of life science specialists and experts across the organization, and we place about $180 million worth of commercial insurance premiums for our life science clients, and over 2,000 of those clients around the world. Myself, I've been working in the sort of commercial insurance space for over 20 years, always specializing within the life sciences. 2 years now in my role leading the life science and healthcare practice at Hub. Prior to that, 14 years on the insurance company side, where I built and ran their life sciences practice. So have seen and evaluated an underwritten risk as it relates to every type of life science company out there. And then a broker before that again for another 7 years. But I ultimately did an undergrad degree in biochemistry and biotechnology and worked for one of my immunology professors and realized that I wasn't cut out for lab work. And eventually stumbled into the insurance industry. And as I mentioned, over 20 years of figuring out and narrowing my focus to become an expert in how to provide insurance and risk management services to that life sciences sector specifically. So as I mentioned, our goal, I mean, the unfortunate reality is that there are very few people in Canada that truly understand insurance and insurance solutions and risk for the life sciences sector. And the challenge is that that short list of people are busy and overwhelmed, and they've simply never put their time and attention towards supporting the startup and SME space. And in turn, that knowledge and expertise is never passed it on into that sort of startup world. So our goal ultimately is just sort of flipping that script and starting to put a focus on how do we engage differently with startups across the country, and then not just engage, but educate and provide support to them as far as helping them figure out what insurance solutions are available and that they might need, and then in turn giving them access to those in a more cost-effective and more efficient manner. So I mean, I talk about the commercialization journey, and I have broken it up into 4 stages. I mean, these don't reflect anything other than how I conceptually think about commercialization in my head. But when I say that, I mean the context is I've separated it into stages where your insurance and your risk changes as you progress through that commercialization journey. So in each stage, there's different things to think about from an insurance perspective and a risk management perspective, and then what solutions are available at each stage. So as we go through, we'll talk through each of them, but much more of a focus on sort of stage 1, 2, and 3. Stage 1 being true companies in their infancy, whether or not they have just come up with a new idea or they're licensing their idea from their hospital or university and creating the foundation of a new startup company. And that would be so those companies right from that true startup stage, even right through to those that are renting space in an accelerator center or an incubator facility, or have their own office space somewhere. But it really is companies that are looking for seed funding really truly in their infancy as they're getting things started. Stage two, companies are now established and they're really focusing on that preclinical validation and testing, and they're looking to ramp up. They're looking for venture capitalist funding. They're looking for angel investors. They're creating boards of directors. They're ultimately becoming more of an established organization. And then stage three is they transition from preclinical into clinical validation and clinical testing, and a significant shift there from a risk profile perspective as companies start engaging with a user group and participants in clinical validation, and then looking for, in theory, additional funding to support that clinical testing and the significant expense that goes along with that, as well as looking for partnerships with potential larger organizations and device companies or pharma companies to help fund that and or to help think about the next stage, which would be the commercialization stage at stage four, where companies are now ready to release and have received the approvals that they would need from Health Canada or the FDA or any other regulator around the world to allow them to launch their product out into the commercial marketplace. And again, a shift in risk at that point to be aware of. As we think about stage one, truly in their infancy, the first coverages that people ultimately are exposed to typically come from when they have either licensed their technology and created the beginnings of a private organization, whether they are within the organization where they were previously working or whether they're looking for office space somewhere. As soon as they have created that company, there is then exposure for that private company as they may be in a hospital still. The hospital may want them to buy general liability coverage and or they're looking for office space for the first time. That lease agreement will require them to carry a certain limit, typically a $2 or a $5 million limit of general liability coverage. And what that general liability coverage is, I mean, most people think about it as a slip and fall policy. And what that means is if you have an office or research space and somebody comes into your office or space and they end up being injured on your premises, that policy is there to respond for any liabilities that you take on because of owning or managing a facility or an office. So anyone that's injured on your space, that policy would respond, as well as it's a premises and an ongoing operations coverage. And what that means is it follows you anywhere that you go. So if you, while working on behalf of the business, are attending a conference, and you bump into a conference booth that collapses, knocks over four more, and you damage people's prototypes. I mean, that risk, they could all come back and sue you to replace them and make them whole. That general liability policy would cover you in that environment as well. But the most common scenario is where there's damage in your office that ends up expanding out into a neighboring office, and you end up damaging somebody else's property as well. And that again would be where the general liability comes into play. And worth noting that the general liability policy excludes anything to do with your product. So it's not covering anyone engaging with your product at this stage. It's really just that slip and fall and that business related risk, excluding the products piece itself. The other coverage at that point would be the property insurance. As you rent an office or a facility and you purchase the general liability for your liabilities from being there and running a business, you likely have laptops, you likely have physical contents in your office. The property policy is intended to, in the event that something damages all of your equipment and contents, if there's a fire in your building, the property policy is there to make you whole and basically reimburse you for the cost of replacing all of that equipment. And it's worth noting that, I mean, one of the things I've listed here is that research and development restoration expense. And as you're looking at property coverage, a standard property policy, if you think about, I mean, the greatest example would be people that have a bunch of time and money spent on research that they're keeping in beakers or in test tubes. A typical property policy, in the event of a fire and everything was damaged, they replace the cost of the test tubes, but they don't replace what was inside that. And that could be months of research and money spent trying to progress your research along. So R&D restoration expense just becomes part of a property policy that would be much more common in a life sciences property policy, but not in a standard office package. So it's worth flagging that as a piece of coverage to be aware of. And again, if you have research animals or living organisms, those things could also be picked up as part of that property policy as well. These policies are, I mean, the general liability is basically typically a minimum premium. It's rated based off of number of locations and/or the square footage, as well as how often are people coming and going from your office. Whereas the property is basically, they come up with a rate based on how safe and secure your office or your facility might be. Is it sprinklered? Is it made of wood or frame? I mean, different things come into consideration to determine a rate that's applied against the total values that you have. So it's the more contents that you have, the more ultimately you will pay for the property insurance. But the better the protection you have for your facility, with it being sprinklered with a security alarm and system, the more you can push down that rate ultimately to control how much you're ultimately going to be paying for the property coverage. As you progress into stage two, I mean, this is where you're ultimately looking at raising funding. You are setting up a board of directors. The insurance from stage one carries through into stage two, so you still need the general liability and the property coverage. But you should now start thinking about a few different coverages. And the first one on the list, the directors and officers liability coverage. As soon as you're looking to attract people to a board of directors, those directors would typically say, well, show me your proof of directors and officers liability. And the reason for that is that coverage really is intended to protect those directors personally in the event that they are dragged into a suit or because of how they have influenced or helped manage the company. Um, and along with that, I mean, that can also extend to the entity itself. So the business can also have coverage through that directors and officers liability coverage for how the business is being managed and how the funds are being used that they have potentially raised. But as these companies start thinking about venture capitalists funding and/or angel investors, really larger rounds of raising funding, that risk grows significantly in that you would then be exposed to more shareholder-related lawsuits where the people who have invested in you are paying close attention to how that money is being spent to make sure that the business decisions are the appropriate ones based on the returns the investors are hoping to get. So the directors and officers liability policy typically comes in at around this stage. With it comes typically as an add-on would be the employment practices liability coverage. And that really is a policy for human resources related functions, but often for companies in this sort of stage two, early stage, they don't have an HR department yet. So this policy actually becomes very critical as far as protecting the organization from things around how they hire and fire people, wrongful dismissals, discrimination, harassment issues in the workplace. These are all things that until companies get an HR department and get policies and procedures in place, these are much more realistic risks and exposures for early stage companies than they typically perceive. And this coverage typically comes along with that directors and officers liability coverage or could be purchased separately if that was of interest. In the early stages, that directors and officers liability coverage is very reasonably priced for a startup company. It can be as low as a couple $1,000s. As you raise more funding, it grows along with as the risk grows, the premiums ultimately grow. And as you progress into stage three and four, I mean, we'll get into that then, but it's the premiums from a directors and officers liability perspective grow exponentially as you hit other milestones from a development perspective. A few other coverages to mention. I mean, cyber liability, much more of a risk for more healthcare related organizations that are storing medical records or patient related information or financial purchaser information. But as soon as people are engaged in storing information of any kind, in theory, they have a cyber liability exposure. And no doubt, as companies are setting up their systems, they would have the potential of sort of ransomware, somebody hacking their system and taking control, and in turn, ransoming access to their system or access to their data to be able to regain control. So cyber liability really is a risk in later stages for life sciences and medical related companies. However, it's important that as a business is getting set up at this stage, and the reason I've included it here is because setting up your internal computer systems in a manner that supports the future purchase of cyber liability is important. And the bare minimums, things like getting multi-factor authentication in place so that employees who are logging in remotely are ultimately it's a higher burden for them to gain access to help keep your network secured. Things like that would be the bare minimum as far as the security that a cyber liability company would expect to see as you get to stage 3 and 4, as far as the infrastructure. So thinking about it early and creating that internal network in a manner that allows you to drive the cost down considerably later is why I've included it here. Employee benefit plans. I mean, a startup at this stage likely has hired a few employees and becomes more of a legitimate company. As you are attracting and trying to attract talent, it becomes more and more important to have employee benefit plans, health plans for your employees. And part of the ability to attract and retain talent comes to what are the additional benefits in addition to salary that goes along with the employment. And benefit plans are a key part of that. So this would be the stage when you would start thinking about that. The challenge historically is that it's challenging to get a competitive employee benefit plan for a small organization, and we'll circle back on that later. The last one on this list, key person life insurance. As venture capitalists are making meaningful investments in organizations, they start to realize that the founder or the chief scientific officer or the person who has created the innovation ultimately is an extremely valuable person, maybe irreplaceable to an organization. And they then would be the ones who would probably push to purchase a key person insurance policy to protect, and it really is a life insurance protecting the key people of an organization to help the company in the event that something happens to those key employees or key people within the organization. So this would be around the stage that companies may think about that coverage as well. As they progress into stage 3, I mean, this is the clinical validation, clinical trials. This could be the first pilot study or a pivotal study for a new assisted technology. Really, it's the first time that a person or a participant is going to interact with your product or your device. And in turn, the clinical trial liability policy is there to protect the company in the event that somebody perceives to have been injured because of their interaction with your product or device as part of participating in a clinical trial or in a clinical study. And it becomes a critical piece of coverage that a lot of companies simply don't plan for far enough in advance. And I'll share a couple stories about that later on, but it's important to realize that there are lots of nuances to this coverage. As you start thinking about where you may conduct a trial, I mean, the costs vary considerably. As an overarching statement, the cost to run a trial in the United States would roughly cost twice as much as that same trial would cost to run in Canada, from an insurance perspective, that is. And trials, if you start thinking about having sites in other countries around the world in order to access the user populations that you might need for your study, there then becomes local insurance requirements in many other countries around the world that would require a local admitted policy. So in theory, you want to have a trial with sites in Poland and Sweden and the UK. Well, Poland may require you to purchase a local clinical trial policy with different limits than what the UK may require, and again, different coverages and limits and deductibles, and you'd have to issue a policy in the local language in those countries. So it becomes much more complex from an insurance perspective and managing the risk. So working with an insurance broker who can source those coverages and work with insurance companies that have the ability to issue local policies becomes critical at this point. And then making sure that you can still structure a Canadian policy to sit sort of above all those local policies around the world would be another factor there as well. But as an overarching statement, the way clinical trial liability premium is determined is you're basically paying a premium per participant. So if you have a study with 10 participants versus a study with 1,000 participants, the insurance companies will come up with a rate and then per participant and then multiply that by the number of participants you have. that rate simply is double in the US than the rate would be in Canada, or about 1.5 times in most other parts of the world in comparison to a trial in Canada. Um, and as you start thinking about the clinical trial coverage, I mean, you may, if you're thinking about sites around the world, you may then need other international coverages. So you may have employees that start residing in other countries, and you may have contracts with organizations in other countries that you need to help evaluate the risk and the transfer of liabilities within, or properties that you need to insure in other countries. So international placement starts to creep in this stage. Transit, supply chain coverage, cargo coverage, different names for it. Really, what we're getting at here is if you are shipping your product to a clinical trial, you should be thinking about making sure you have the appropriate insurance in place for that shipment itself, or for whatever vehicle or transportation method you're using. And often the shipping companies that are utilized, the insurance that they provide is nowhere close to appropriate from a valuation perspective of what your prototypes likely would be or what your clinical trial samples might be. So it's critical to work with an insurance company that can actually properly value your product. Again, all based on the value and the controls in place and the sensitivity of that product while it's being shipped. In that, if you're shipping a temperature sensitive good, it needs to be obviously refrigerated within the temperature parameters. And if it deviates from that, I mean, you could have millions of dollars or lost research there in clinical trial samples or product that needs to be destroyed simply because the shipping company didn't maintain the appropriate temperature throughout that shipment. So starting to think about that and managing the risk there is an important one. This is also the stage where companies start thinking about intellectual property insurance. They could think about it earlier, but as they get to this point, they've really validated the technology and they're then open to considering the expense of purchasing coverage for helping manage that. And this intellectual property insurance is both defensive in nature in that it can respond in the event that somebody claims that you have breached or encroached on their patent, and alternatively can respond to protect you if you think somebody has encroached on your patent ultimately. So it's both. And there are significant costs, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, with managing the risk of, or managing a company claiming that you're infringing on their patents. And often, as much as we hate to say it, I mean, we do see that as a defensive tactic at times for competitors to try to slow each other down by claiming that companies are infringing on their patents. So it's certainly a coverage that's worth considering once you get to this point, in that it provides meaningful value and what is a real risk to companies as the word starts getting out that you exist and that you have the technology that you have. And then stage four, I mean, you've transitioned here from basically preclinical and into clinical and now into a commercialization stage. And here you would have received your Health Canada or your FDA approvals, and you're ready to launch your product. And then, in theory, the clinical trial liability coverage that we talked about, that is there to protect the company if they're held liable, or the perception is that the product that was being tested causes an injury to the product user. That really is the same risk for product liability. It's just now for approved products out in the commercial marketplace. And the product liability is there to respond in the event that someone using your product perceives to have been injured and they think it's as a result of their using your product. And that is, I mean, the most common coverage that companies ultimately need to purchase once they are commercialized. And there's significant risk from any type of a medical related product that people may rely on that device or that technology to their detriment, and then there would be suits brought back against them. And as much as any company thinks they may have mitigated that risk, that exposure exists. And really, anytime somebody is injured, especially if you're selling product into the US, lawyers do a very good job of making sure that within that statement of claim, they've included everything they can to drag in as many different parties as possible, to have as many different insurance policies there to help make that injured party or multiple injured parties whole and support them if they have a significant cost to those claims as far as the ongoing medical care and or lost income that could go along with some of those claims. So product liability being critical as you get to this stage. I've included directors and officers liability again here because of just how much that exposure has grown over the commercialization of your product. Often companies around here are looking at potentially an IPO to raise funding to support the commercialization, and that directors and officers premium may go, as an example, from a few $1,000s in the stage one, and it may progress, or stage two may progress as you've raised significant funding. It may progress to that $5,000 to $10,000 range. As you are commercializing, it may progress into that $100,000 range, depending on the exposure and or around clinical testing. There's lots of risk there around whether or not the studies get the approvals or not, and a failed attempt at getting an approval typically leads to shareholder litigation, so the directors and officers exposure is even larger. And then if you think about an initial public offering, that's then opening up the company from a reporting perspective to a much higher standard. Shareholder litigation is much more commonplace at this point, and companies that are in theory listing on US stock exchanges would be expected to pay, I mean, it could be over $1 million in the directors and officers liability premium alone. So starting to think about and be aware of some of those costs is important. Um, and at this stage, I mean, the property policy that we started with likely has evolved considerably, and you need to think about all sorts of other sort of subsets of property-related coverage, whether it's for pollution or environmental risk, whether it's radiation contamination, things that devices may incorporate. But fundamentally, the biggest coverage that was missing beforehand that now should be added in is the business interruption or dependent business income related coverage. And what that is if you at this stage, you are a manufacturer of a device, if you have a property claim and your facility burns down, I mean, yes, you would have your property policy to help make you whole and fix the facility and get it back up and running. But you also very likely can't manufacture products for a period of time, and that lost revenue can be covered through a business interruption policy. And there's all sorts of tools to help create and determine what that value is that you should be insuring, but it's coming up with an appropriate limit to help make you whole, to help you get back up and running as quickly as possible, and then to make you whole with respect to the money that you've lost because you couldn't sell your product in that time. And I've included here that dependent business income. I mean, it's similar concept, except if you're using a contract manufacturer and they have a loss and can't manufacture your product for you, you again can get coverage there for your lost income while you get out and try to find somebody else to replace them in manufacturing your product. So some different coverages to think about once you get to this stage. But as we sort of step back from the journey and the coverages themselves, I mean, the reality is your insurance needs evolve as you work your way through the commercialization journey. And we're uh, at Hub ultimately trying to sort of flip the script with respect to stage one and two specifically, but we work with companies of every size and shape as you work your way through this journey. Um, Thinking specifically about stage one and two, I mean, the challenge historically is that a startup company ultimately, when they're ready to purchase this coverage, has been pushed out into the world on their own to try and find this coverage and find a broker, first off, who knows what they're doing, who knows what coverage is to find, and then two, negotiate with insurance companies on behalf of this new startup to find the best coverage and the best price. So there's a knowledge that's needed and an expertise that's needed to find the right coverage, but typically you end up paying what we would call a minimum premium, which an insurance company would say, in order to buy a $5 million general liability policy to meet the leasing requirements at your new incubator or accelerator facility, the cost is going to be $2,000 as an example. And prices vary a little bit, but they're roughly in that range. And the challenge there is that insurance companies are evaluating each of these companies as individual buyers. And what we have done and what we're doing differently is that we're sort of flipping that and saying, what if we aggregated hundreds of startup companies across the country and started negotiating with insurance companies based on the aggregate of hundreds as opposed to each individual one doing it on their own. And in turn, we're able to drive that minimum premium down based on efficiencies and based on approach. And as opposed to being about $2,000, we're now down in that $400 to $500 range for the same coverage. And we've negotiated sort of the broadest coverage available in the marketplace for that. So we're ultimately, as we shift the focus from being individual to an aggregated startup approach, we're really seeing significant benefits from a cost perspective, and again, able to procure all the right coverages in that aggregated approach. Through partnerships with Kite and Access to Success, I mean, you have access to this sort of exclusive program where, again, you would expect at a time when, I mean, every dollar ultimately counts. You can expect to see significant cost savings here, and in turn, know that you're working with insurance brokers that have built these insurance programs to give the right coverages that you need that can then grow with you as you progress along that commercialization journey. At this stage, so from a life sciences policy perspective, I've listed all those initial coverages that are available from a startup perspective. As part of that initial purchase, it can be any of them. It can be just the premises, general liability to get started. But again, your policy should evolve with you as you work your way through. And then the employee benefits approach, we've done the exact same thing ultimately. Historically, if you're a startup company with 3 employees, you you arguably can't get the coverage that you should have, and or you will pay way too much to get it because you're only 3 or 4 employees. We've aggregated again hundreds of startups together into a pool so that you are able to access much broader employee benefit plans to be able to incentivize employees to join and or stay much earlier in your development. Again, because we have taken that aggregated approach to sourcing coverage. As you progress into clinical trials and clinical validation, again, because we are working with hundreds of startup companies across the country, we are then also then supporting them on their clinical trial placement. And because of that, we've got a few different partnerships with insurance companies that specialize in this, some that specialize more in the Canadian, North American market, some that specialize in sourcing coverage anywhere in the world that you may want to conduct a trial, with the caveat being countries that typically, any sanctioned countries typically are challenging to source coverage within. But outside of sanctioned countries, almost any other country in the world, we can procure coverage there, all supported by a local policy that would be placed here in Canada for you. Again, at this point, it's really about working with companies or brokerages that have access to the right insurance companies around the world to support your placement here. And then as you progress into the commercialization stage, not going to go through this. This is a busy slide. The reality is these are all different types of coverages and things to think about and services that, I mean, Hub or life science specialists can provide. Things like product recall coverage. I mean, as you get going, there's a never-ending number of insurance solutions to start thinking about and start evaluating, and just making sure that you're with a broker that understands the nuances of life science risk at this point becomes the critical piece of it all to be able to advise you on each and every one of these subjects. It really is, again, it's an underserved niche. There are so few people in Canada with knowledge and expertise here that, again, would strongly encourage you to make sure that your broker fits that sort of box as far as being able to advise you through every aspect of this. And having worked with, again, hundreds of startups over my career, I would reiterate that insurance is never a discussion early enough. As we think about claim scenarios, I mean, you obviously want to have the right insurance before that claim pops up. The most common example for a startup or a small medium enterprise really is you have an office or a research space within an incubator or an accelerator lab. In this example, during a routine equipment test, a small malfunction in a cooling system causes a leak that damages not just your research, but also the neighboring lab's sensitive electronics. And that type of a claim happens frequently, where what happens in your facility can damage the surrounding, whether it be a flood that could damage the neighbor or the tenant below you. It could be a fire where smoke can damage neighboring units. But worth being aware of, a claim like that actually triggers both of the general liability and the property coverage that we were talked about beforehand, in that the damage to your own research, your own property, that's going to be covered through your property policy as long as you've purchased the right coverage and as long as you have the right limits. I mean, you should be made whole for whatever has been damaged within your unit. But the damage to neighboring units, I mean, that is your liability. That's the general liability from being there having an office. That's why when you sign a lease agreement at an accelerator center or in an office building, the reason why they require you to carry a certain limit of general liability coverage is exactly this. It's that you can damage other people's property and or the building itself, and your general liability policy would respond to protect you in that environment. So an important coverage and worth being aware of both of those as you're getting started to make sure that you have both of those coverage in your infancy. This is just a story that I do like to share because this is a real story that's a few years old that I was at the insurance company at the time evaluating risk. But this is a great example of the importance of, and you don't need to read it, but the importance of planning and thinking about insurance earlier in your business planning. This was a startup medical device company that was developing a pediatric implant device to help children with spine abnormalities walk normally. And they had done everything right. They had raised funding. There was lots of promise in that. They were getting ready to start their first in human trial. They had partnered with a reputable clinical research organization in the US who had engaged with a children's hospital. Everything was set up until the children's hospital asked for the certificate of clinical trial liability coverage. And what happened at that point was the company scrambled to try to procure that coverage. So it ended up landing on my desk to come up with what premium should we charge for this company. And the broker went out to a whole bunch of insurance companies. And at the end of the day, the quote that I had put out was the most cost effective and the best coverage. But the reality was that for a 10 million limit, the premium was $600,000 because we were dealing with children that would be a high risk group, and it was an implantable device that was an invasive device. And the cost, the trial was in the US, so it was a much higher rate than it would have been if it was in Canada. And the reality in this scenario was they hadn't planned for this cost. They didn't think about it, it wasn't budgeted, and in turn, they couldn't afford it and they couldn't get the insurance in place in order to start the trial because starting the trial, this was a requirement, was showing proof of this coverage. And what ended up happening was the VC firm decided that, well, first off, they tried to pivot the trial and conduct it in Canada to cut the price from 600 to 300, but then they couldn't find enough people, enough children to support the trial in Canada. And in turn, the VC firm ultimately moved on and sort of forced the selling of the technology to a larger device company, and the company has ceased to exist. And the cost, it was sold at a fraction of what the technology should have been valued at. So, I use this example as a real life example because it speaks to the importance of getting the insurance in the business planning discussion much sooner. Now, not everybody is looking at a price tag of $600,000 for their clinical trial liability coverage. It would often be a fraction of that and couldn't be thousands of dollars as opposed to even tens of thousands. But it really depends on the device, it depends on how invasive it is, and it depends on the population and the number of people that are going to be exposed to your product. But starting to talk about it with your broker much earlier on so your broker can evaluate the risk of your product and help you plan for what the costs are going to be as you progress is an important step that most people overlook. I've included an FAQ section, really just a couple things that are questions that I always get asked. We're pre-revenue. Do we really need insurance right now? The reality is in that first claims example, yes. You need a general liability policy at a bare minimum. And some companies don't buy the property because they just have laptops and they don't feel like they need the property policy. Understandable, but as soon as you have a business and you're traveling for business and you have a premises, you do need that general liability policy. So even though you're pre-revenue, there's still a need for insurance coverage, especially as you work towards clinical validation. There's a need there as well. What if I already have coverage? Do I need to review it? Your company can evolve very quickly, ultimately, and the risk of your company can change with minor business decisions and things like you're in stage 3 doing clinical validation, but you realize that your platform technology has commercial value to other parties. So you start engaging with third parties to make revenue to help fund your own research. Well, that brings with it a need for professional liability coverage because other companies are holding you out as a service provider to be accountable, and they're relying on you as being the expert. So there's other coverages that you need very quickly because you've made a slight business pivot to start making revenue earlier on the side. So yes, you should regularly, annually be reviewing your insurance, making sure you're reviewing it with educated brokers, and then in turn, making sure that you're, depending on your stage, that you're with a broker who can access the most competitive coverage. Because again, an acknowledgement that every dollar matters to companies in their early stages, and procuring the most cost-effective solution likely matters. And the last question that I had, my clinical study is a comparative study, not an official clinical trial. Do I need coverage? I mean, I've seen a large number of claims from comparative studies. The reality is, as soon as your product is exposed to people in any way, shape, or form, you can be named in a suit along with it. And I've seen claims from comparative studies where they ultimately a patient is injured as a part injured from the standard of care that's being compared against, but because they were exposed to both products in the study, they name both companies. So there's a duty to defend, and it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars in defense costs in order to simply validate that your product wasn't the cause of the loss. So anytime anybody is exposed to your product, yes, there's a need for some clinical trial coverage there. And that's the end. I mean, again, I'm opening it up for questions in the chat. Ultimately, there's my email address. If people want to connect and chat after the fact, don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to connect you with wherever you may be across the country. Happy to connect you with our team of life science specialists, wherever you might be, or happy to get a call set up directly if you want to chat through in more detail. I was saying at the beginning, just before the call started, that this was a presentation that I practiced a couple of days ago, and it was an hour and a half. So I really did have to condense it and rush through it very quickly. But I will pause there and stop sharing and turn it back over to see if there's any questions that may come up.
Liam, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think you gave a ton of information in that short period of time. So great job. We had a lot of great questions in the chat that were quickly answered as your presentation continued, which was great. There were a couple questions around intellectual property insurance. Matthew had a question about needing that freedom to operate in order to unlock some of that kind of insurance benefit. So could you expand on that a bit more of what's needed?
As specifically for intellectual property coverage, what's needed? I mean, from a freedom to operate, I think, I mean, you nailed it. The ability to continue to focus on developing your own product without the concern and not have to be as externally focused as companies may feel like they need to be is an important part of it. Intellectual property coverage is something that, I mean, 10 years ago existed, but was priced in a manner that was almost unavailable, in that the perceived risk of defending and managing patent-related risk was so cost prohibitive that insurance companies charged an arm and a leg in order to procure the coverage. But we're now seeing insurance companies much more comfortable with the risk, starting to build it into their packaged life science policies, even with sublimits of coverage there for both the defense and more proactively outlooking costs that could occur. And the underwriting piece of it really comes down to getting a sense of what patents exist ultimately from within the company. And if the larger the portfolio of patents and the more complex it might be, the more underwriters are going to evaluate it, and potentially the more risk that they may perceive. So it's hard to say exactly what the underwriting is going to be because everyone's situations will be different. But it really comes down to the product that's being developed, what the patents entail, what the likelihood is. Like if it's a very disruptive product that several large medical device companies are going to be very upset with your development and your technology, and you're going to disrupt the standard of care, there's a much greater likelihood of somebody coming after you for patent infringement in that scenario, whether you have or you haven't. So there's factors to consider in that, but I don't know whether that answered the question or not, but that would be sort of the high level thoughts on IP related coverage.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, definitely very kind of complicated space, but that, yeah, you answered it great. We also have one more question about employment liability insurance. Do you
Yeah.
need to have a formal kind of HR process in place, like performance reviews, things like that, in order for the coverage to be granted?
Yeah. And no is the initial answer. I mean, the reality being companies, as they hire their first few employees, they will never have that set up. I mean, that typically doesn't come until they build out more of a robust HR department and they have somebody hired to actually oversee the hiring and firing and management of employees and goal settings and sort of standard employee procedures and an employee handbook. So things like that will help and certainly will help reduce the cost of the insurance as you progress. But that's not a barrier to entry for a small startup company. So if you're only a 3 to 5 person organization without that in the infancy, certainly coverage is still readily available at this point in time to make sure that you can, well, source the right coverage and protect yourself in the event that it's not being, that you haven't managed hiring and firing employees in an appropriate manner. So yes, it's certainly available.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We all learned so much, and I'm sure there's going to be more questions that will come up, but we can certainly continue the discussions offline. So, just as a reminder for folks in the room of our upcoming events, so our Accessibility Innovation Exchange, as well as our demo day, please feel free to register using the QR codes and connect with us, continue to work with us to enable everyone. And again, thank you for your time.